Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me this morning. Hopefully we'll have a productive discussion here regarding the establishing a qualified electrical worker program. In my safety talks, I find that this is a very popular topic of discussion. Everyone is usually fully aware that these determinations, these assessments need to be made, but frequently a very involved topic of discussion is, well, under what criteria, what method am I to use to determine, whether or not this person meets the ingredients, the demand for being a qualified worker, and understandably so. I mean, it is it's a very fluid task, trying to determine, whether or not this person meets the requirements with so many varied demands. But that being said, I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Mike Lietzel. I've been a Trainco instructor here probably 6 or 7 years now. I've been full-time for several years, but I was a contractor for several years before that. And I've had about 20, 22 years experience in the electrical trade in some way, shape, or form. Like I said, I thank you for joining me, and I try to do my best to answer as many of your questions and address as many concerns as I can. TPC Trainco, for those of you that may not be all that familiar with us, we have several different divisions that can serve needs rather well on helping companies address some of these requirements that are being handed out through various entities and certain standards that need to be made or met. TPC Training, the one that I'm affiliated with, is a very successful provider of technical training, industrial training, safety training, and such, and very successful at meeting the needs of various customers in a wide variety of fields. TPC Online is another venue that we are really expanding in. It's in many ways it's the 21st century version of training. The technological advances that we've made as a society are really opening doors and opening ways that we can reach very large and widely varied audiences, and definitely looking forward to a much more successful moving forward in that venue. TPC Consulting Services, very convenient for a lot of customers, a lot of industries to have us come in and serve as consulting subject matter experts, help address site-specific concerns or issues that companies just not 100% sure how to address or how to move forward from. And when you have this many people, Trainco is a rather sizable company with a lot of varied levels and many years of experience at the available call. It's nice to be able to have that pool of experience to draw on to help companies solve some of their problems. And also TPC iSchematic is a very exciting offering that allows us to come into a facility and come up with some rather detailed, hyper accurate drawings and processes in order to facilitate a much more successful maintenance and troubleshooting program within these facilities. It's a very successful program that is once again going to really open doors moving forward. That being said, the reason why we're here is this pesky little term right here. If you have any familiarity with this document that this entire discussion is based on, the NFPA 70E document, this term rears its ugly head quite frequently throughout this document. A qualified person is necessary in order to perform this process, or only qualified persons are allowed within this area or within this boundary, so on and so forth. And this is the basis for so many ongoing questions that I get from students, from supervisors, from company owners. What is the criteria for determining, whether someone is qualified? Well, if we just look at the definition here, one who has demonstrated skills and knowledge related to the construction and operation of the electrical equipment. If we just stop right there, that in and of itself is a mouthful. Well, how much knowledge? Where does the knowledge come from, or where is it required to come from? How do I know if the knowledge this person claims to have, or the knowledge that they so obviously are able to provide proof of through the things that as a supervisor I've seen them perform in the past? How do I know if what I'm seeing is indicative of an adequate amount of knowledge? I mean, this is a difficult definition to address when it comes to qualifying somebody. The term demonstrated skills in and of itself has to be defined as far as what they're looking at, as far as what skills, and how have they been and when have they been demonstrated. All that being said, you move into the other half of the definition, and now we're looking at, has the worker also received safety training to identify and avoid the hazards involved? The demanding part of that is the fact that it is specific safety training, and not just knowledge to avoid this hazard and not to do this, not to do that, so on and so forth. There is very specific information that is required to be part of this accepted or recognized safety training that each of the so-called qualified persons are required to have. We'll go through some of these ingredients here as we proceed forward. But these three fundamental components, the demonstrated skills, the knowledge, whoops, I went the wrong direction, pardon me, the safety training, I want to break them down into some individual components. There is a specific definition that the terms in the 70E document in the NFPA standard is based on. And that's where this clause, this statement of has demonstrated skills comes from. Interpreting this in many ways is based on the company owner or the supervisor or the manager having knowledge of whether or not the person in question, one, has performed this task before. They've known from experience of working around this person or having witnessed them performing these duties in the past that you can in fact attest that you have witnessed them performing this task in the past, or at least utilizing these required skills. Where it becomes questionable, where it becomes a little tricky to apply this term or determine whether or not someone meets this definition is when it's an electrical task that it may not necessarily be anything uncommon, but it is not a task, not a specific task that the person in question has ever performed, at least within the memory of the person making the determination. So now it starts getting a little cloudy as to whether or not the supervisor, the person who is charged with making this determination, can justifiably say that this person does in fact possess the skills. Because performing a task in one piece of equipment that they're familiar with and performing the same task in a piece of equipment that they're not familiar with, even though the task is the same, the fact that they've never worked in that piece of equipment that they're not as familiar with in and of itself can be a hazard to the worker. So they may possess the skills, but they may not possess the associated knowledge with where they're going to be applying these skills because of their lack of familiarity with the equipment. So it really gets tricky as far as assessing whether or not this person does in fact meet the requirements of what this term asks of them, so to speak. Now let's take it and go one step further. Let's say we know for a fact, based on our knowledge, both with the so-called qualified worker and us as their manager or their supervisor, we know for a fact that they're going to have to wear the PPE. We know for a fact that We meet the requirements to leave the energy on. We can justify the fact that we're going to do energized work. But now we're charged with making this determination. Can the worker actually perform the task in question while wearing the PPE? So once again, we can justify the fact that we're going to leave the power on, but we have not definitely made the decision or made the determination that the worker, yes, they may possess the skills at hand, but when utilizing those skills and meeting the requirements of wearing the PPE, can they demonstrate the ability to perform the task in question while wearing all of this PPE? There are several just quick items that come to mind that will most definitely be effective once you put on this PPE. Anyone that's ever worn it knows the first thing that goes out of your wheelhouse, so to speak, is dexterity. When you put those rubber gloves and the leather protectors on top of them, a significant amount of dexterity is lost. If you're wearing an arc flash hood, right away it's almost like working in the dark, because the lighting that seemed perfectly adequate before you put that on, all of a sudden it is very inadequate as far as you being able to see not just what you're working on, but what you're working around. Never mind, the one here in the middle, as far as how much it restricts your field of view. So as far as demonstrating an ability, it's not just, have they performed these tasks, or can you confirm as their supervisor that they possess these skills? Another means, another demand as far as this quote again of has demonstrated these skills. Have they demonstrated the ability to perform these skills in the rather uncomfortable manner of wearing this PPE while they're doing it? So that being said, and in perspective of where we're headed with this discussion, to try to sit down and come up with a definitive checklist, a definitive set of conformities that have to be met in determining whether or not someone meets this definition. It's almost like there are purposefully gray areas built into this definition, built into this assessment. And in many ways it has to be this way, because there is such a wide variety of not only work tasks that an electrical worker may be faced with performing on various pieces of equipment, but there's such a wide variety of hazards that can be encountered, such a wide variety of equipment designs, of system designs. So every one of them, anyone who's ever taken my safety class, they've been taught since the very beginning that as soon as the question comes up as to whether or not they're qualified or not, the first two words that I want to pop into their mind are, for what? What is the specific task on what specific equipment that I'm being asked to perform? And that is the beginning of the assessment. It has to be that specific, because if we overly generalize this whole process, it's not a question of if, it's only a question of when someone is overly generalized in making the determination about their qualifications, and we find out the hard way that they weren't in fact qualified. And that's what the whole system is really trying to avoid. So next frame here, let's break this down a little bit into a little bit of what I was just describing. As far as the skills, we pretty much addressed that. Performance of those skills, demonstration, to use their word, of those skills. As a supervisor, yes, you can in fact demand that, look, if I'm going to ask you to do this, I would very much like you to demonstrate right in front of me right now that you can in fact perform these skills. But if you think about it in many ways, if you take those skills, they can actually be considered part of their knowledge base. What is this person's training history? What is this person's educational history within their trade? Where did they acquire these skills? Was it something they were taught on the job? Is it just something that they look that on YouTube, we don't know. And how specific do the skills apply to the task at hand? That same specificity can be applied to their knowledge as well. Anyone who we are looking at as to whether or not they're qualified, and we have necessarily deemed qualified, should with no doubt whatsoever be able to definitively say when they are justified, when OSHA recognizes that they are allowed to do energized work. That's one of the basic tenets of arc flash training, is that you do in fact know and recognize whether or not you specifically meet what I call the exceptions to the primary rule is that you simply do not work on things energized. Well, someone with the training would know, having had the discussion in the class, that those exceptions apply to certain unacceptable risks that would be created by shutting the power off. And in the interest of, say, a hospital, there's certain systems you can't shut down in a hospital, even though hospitals do have backups to the backups. When you run the risks of possibly creating a more dangerous situation for someone by creating a safe situation for yourself, when certain systems by design, when certain processes can't be shut down in the interest of creating a safe work condition for you. These are the type of conditions that OSHA recognizes that there are in fact going to be times when the power can't be shut off, when the work condition can't be made safe. Knowledge of those exceptions, knowledge of what OSHA mandates in these documents is something that a qualified person would know right out of the gate. There would be no question whatsoever whether or not this person is informed about it. Next one here, a qualified person must have the ability to recognize all hazards that might be associated with the work task. Well, that's about as fundamental and elementary as you can get as far as whether or not you as their supervisor or coworker are going to allow them, to perform this task. That would be mighty reckless to assume or knowingly allow someone to perform a task within reach of certain hazards, knowing full well that they can't be fully expected to recognize those hazards. So that, in many ways, that is not a tough criteria to apply there. May get a little trickier as far as determining, do they in fact possess the knowledge? Are they in fact fully aware? And then, of course, the second half of this one, based on their knowledge, based on their awareness of these hazards, do they know how to address these hazards appropriately? Once again, that goes back to their knowledge base. If they're claiming to have this knowledge, well, where did they pick it up? Where were they given this knowledge, and from who? Next one, qualified person must understand the limitations of test equipment. Example, voltage testers, how to select the appropriate one, how to apply them properly. And this goes back to work skills once again, but also it's a product of the arc flash safety training, the mandated training that qualified workers receive, because one of the first things that you talk about in that class when you start talking about safety equipment is whether or not a worker can look at their test equipment and recognize what type of electrical environment is it rated for. How much of an adverse or unusual electrical condition could take place, and still the worker could still count on this equipment to adequately protect them. Using the wrong piece of electrical equipment in the wrong location in the wrong way can actually cause the very thing that we're trying to avoid. So, assessing someone's qualifications, quote unquote, is in many ways, checking their awareness of not just how to use the equipment, but how do they know that what they're using is in fact the right equipment. Moving on to the next one, they must understand the construction and operation of the equipment associated with the planned task. Well, that's one of the most fundamental assessment criteria that you can think of. Would you want your auto mechanic working on the engine in your car if he wasn't 100% sure how it worked? I mean, that'd make me a little nervous as far as I'm concerned. It's unbelievable that so many places out there, just for sheer lack of availability of someone who is more qualified, are okay with letting someone who isn't fully qualified go out and explore a piece of electrical equipment, assuming that they're not going to wander too deeply into this thing in order to try to figure out how it works so that they can try to troubleshoot and repair it. Well, that's just the definition of reckless as far as looking out for workers, but it happens. Another one, licensing. Licensing pops up in so many classes. I've had people raise their hand in my class in the middle of this discussion and say, well, I know I'm qualified because I'm a licensed electrician. A license, albeit there are times when you have to pass a test, you have to achieve a certain level of confirmation or assessment or whatever in order to be granted that license. It is not the definitive tool. It's not the accurate reflection that a lot of people think that it is. An example that I use for a lot of people is, a lot longer than what I really want to admit. I took a driver's test with the state of Pennsylvania, and they gave me a driver's license. That was not an accurate reflection of my driving ability there. For one thing, I mean, I'm from Pennsylvania. If I took my driver's test in June, was that a reflection of my ability to drive on snow-covered roads? There's a good chance I may have never driven on snow-covered roads. But yet the state of Pennsylvania, after giving me a test, both a written test and an actual demonstration test, issued me a license. So with that in mind, if you're assessing someone's ability, I'm not saying ignore the fact that they have a license, but don't overweight the fact that they have a license. It all goes back to what we talked about before, is this is very task specific. This assessment, this determination has to be focused on the exact task that this person is about to apply their knowledge and apply their skills to. We have to be careful not to overgeneralize. The license in and of itself, as we were just talking about, is not a guarantee that they're qualified for all tasks at hand. Electrical work, in and of itself, take this from someone who's been doing this for about 25 years. One of the reasons why I was attracted to this trade was the fact that it requires ongoing education. There's always new technologies, new techniques, new equipment design out there that requires someone in this trade to stay on the cutting edge in many ways. It's exciting, but it's also demanding. And it's the kind of industry where in newer types of design, newer types of capabilities of equipment, it's not always conducive to safety to apply antiquated work practices or antiquated safety approaches. It's the kind of industry that requires workers to stay on the cutting edge. So back to our term here again. We've talked about demonstrated skills. We've talked about methods through which we can visually verify that a person may or may not possess the required skills or the needed skills for the task at hand. We've talked about methods of assessing their knowledge, determining whether or not they possess the prerequisite training, the background, if you will. Third topic, safety training. This is a biggie. There is a lot of criteria here. There are a lot of mandated ingredients to this assessment. I'll give you a taste of a few right here. Does the worker understand the hazards associated with the task at hand? Does the worker understand fundamentally what an arc flash risk assessment is? You hand someone a full-fledged incident energy study. You hand them a 3-ring binder that has all of the results of an arc flash study. study, the fault current analysis. It requires a certain level of technical knowledge to assess and make sense of a lot of that information. You take the average worker and you show them an arc flash label on a piece of equipment. It's not too difficult for them to assess or interpret certain amounts of that information. But some of it you have to question whether or not they fully grasp the meaning of what some of those values are telling them. And once again, if we're assessing this person's qualifications, that's the answer to a question that we need to know. Based on the information that they may see on the label, does the worker understand how to apply that information? Do they understand the limitations, the benefits of the personal protective equipment? A fundamental question that I ask my students all the time, just to make sure that they are, in fact, making the connection, is, why is it that in one piece of equipment of a certain voltage, a certain current level, I'm able to wear what is very, apparently minimum levels of PPE, but yet if I take them into what could quite possibly be the exact same type of equipment, the same voltage level, same current capabilities, all of a sudden they need to wear significantly more PPE. And it's not that, I think that they don't understand why they need the PPE. They don't fully understand why those conditions have changed and why all of a sudden they need so much more PPE. So it's a very tricky thing to assess sometimes when it comes to certain locations and certain workers. Have they been trained to understand and apply the details of the electrical safety program? Well, stop right there. You can go one step further with that. I encounter a lot of people in my classes who were never aware that they actually have to have a specific electrically dedicated safety program. I mean, you ask them, well, do you have a safety program in place? Oh, yeah, we've had one in place for years. How about an electrical safety program? And all of a sudden you get no reaction. Well, wasn't that the same thing? No. You do have your overall health and safety program in place. The electrically dedicated safety program is one aspect of your overall health and safety program. And it's where all of these requirements, where all of these determinations, all this criteria and everything is listed. And it becomes part of your overall safety program. Now, some other things, some other tangibles that can come into play. Certain workers may or may not be exposed to certain levels of hazard based on their job tasks, but the ones that are have to be trained to identify when these risks rear their heads, when they are in fact going to be exposed to what is deemed an unacceptable risk. In other words, we have to shut the power off. We have to make sure that this is performed in what they call an electrically safe work condition. That can't be something ambiguous. It has to be laid out in the program as to whether or not people are in fact knowledgeable to make these determinations. People need to be trained in the actual, as they say right here, or even potential hazards involved with a situation. Their knowledge base has to allow for them to recognize enough about what they're doing to be able to see when conditions have changed. Maybe when conditions have become significantly more dangerous, and the untrained or the unqualified, to use their term, might not be expected to recognize the difference or that the conditions have evolved. The level of hazard, that's a given. In many ways, people aren't fully aware of just how dangerous of a situation they're in when they're doing electrical work. The connection, the relationship, if you will, between the degree or the level of hazard and the types of injuries that they could be exposed to. This one, I love seeing the reaction on people's faces when I show them the first albeit it's a mundane piece of electrical equipment. There's nothing significantly overtly powerful about it. It's a very typical industrial rated disconnect switch. But I absolutely love seeing the reflection on their faces, especially from the ones that work around that exact same piece of equipment all the time. And they had no clue whatsoever that that piece of equipment could deliver such a significant fireball whenever it folded out. There are a lot of people out there that are working under that false sense of security. They just absolutely have no idea how bad of a day they could have working around these pieces of equipment that they work around every day. Each and every employee exposed to the risks are required to be trained in the means of avoiding or mitigating the exposure to hazards. I mean, this can be a simple matter of the right way and a wrong way to lay down insulated blankets or establish contact barriers to where an inadvertent movement would prevent you from accidentally making contact, or establishing some means of preventing the arc flash from developing. Once again, it's just a matter of anyone who is exposed to the risks, whether or not they're electrical workers or not, have to be trained in how to mitigate these risks. And the level of their training, the level of their knowledge is mandated by the level and the depth of the work that they're going to be asked to perform. The training depends on a lot of factors. Once again, what was the first thing that I said to be asked? You know, whenever everyone is questioning qualifications or training, what are they going to be doing? You know, it's a big industry. It's a very comprehensive, wide-ranging trade. You have to be specific in your concerns so that you can be specific in your training requirements. Is the employee a manager, a supervisor, or is it in fact one of the workers? Different job titles, different sets of responsibilities, whichever the case may be, are going to call upon different levels, or are going to call for different levels of training. It's going to warrant different levels of training based on their job description and also the responsibilities that they carry. A supervisor may or may not be required to possess the actual hands-on skills, but they would most definitely be expected to know enough about the task to recognize whether or not the worker is in fact doing it properly, to recognize whether or not they're exercising certain precautions or applying certain mitigating equipment in order to reduce the hazard. So once again, you have to look at what are the expectations, what are the end goals for the training, to look at, you know, how in-depth and how detailed the training should be. If they're an unqualified person, you have a certain responsibility to them in the fact that they are simply present in the facility. They are working around electrical equipment. One of my favorite questions is, you know, to my workers is, you're doing energized work, you're out in the middle of a plant, you have your barrier set up, you have your warning tape around your work area, you've established your arc flash boundary. You know full well not to get inside that boundary, because when you do, you are in fact being, you know, exposed to an arc flash hazard if the arc actually takes place. Could you honestly say that everyone in the plant who's an unqualified person, who isn't an electrical worker, would know not to do that, know not to go through that ribbon? I've watched people already look around, they'll look at the area, there's nobody there, but yet it's taped off, and if there's no one around to stop them, they'll duck under and keep right on going and have no idea whatsoever that they just walked into what could be a quite dangerous, if not deadly, environment. So you have to ask these questions about the unqualified as well. It's not that we're going to ask them to do electrical work, but they're going to be around while it's taking place. Are they aware of the risks, the hazards of simply being in a certain proximity to where this work is taking place? Do said employees need to be a qualified person, or do they just need to be qualified for a specific task? There's a difference. You can teach and enlighten someone about the risks associated with, say, turning on a disconnect. But it's an altogether different task to try to qualify that person for actually working in a disconnect. So it calls for you to look at what level of knowledge does this person actually need for the task at hand, or is it just they need to be made aware of certain hazards that they're going to be exposed to. Moving forward, does the worker know how to determine when the work can be justified? We talked about that. There's 3 exceptions that are basically granted by OSHA. If shutting the power off and making it safe for you to work on could create a more dangerous situation, if the equipment design and the circuit just doesn't allow for de-energized work, the magic word they use is infeasibility. You simply can't do what you came there to do with the power off. Either the design of the equipment or what you need to do needs the power to be on, like troubleshooting. You can't check voltage if the power isn't on. You can't check the current draw on a motor if you can't start the motor up. Well, that pretty much mandates that the power is going to have to be on. And of course, the other one is if it's under 50 volts, it's not considered to be a hazardous energy level. But if you don't meet those 3 criteria, you have to be able to justify, well, in plain language, you can't justify it if you can't meet one of those 3 criteria. Employees need to know how to determine if an energized work permit is required. Fundamentally, in the safety industry, the primary trigger for an energized work permit is anytime anyone is going to get within what's called the restricted approach boundary. Now, without turning it into an arc flash class, what that is it's a reflection of the person's knowledge. If the person doesn't know where the restricted approach boundary is, he couldn't be expected to be considered qualified, because that's basic knowledge to a qualified, safety-trained electrical worker. Do they, in fact, know how to create an electrically safe work condition? This is a defined process. A lot of people misinterpret this. And once again, if you've never had the arc flash safety training, odds are you've never been fully instructed in how to create an electrically safe work condition. There's more to it than just shutting the power off. And these are the kind of things that workers absolutely have to be trained in. This is a biggie. Does your worker, if needed to, know how to perform a hazard analysis? Can they look at what's about to take place and do a shock risk assessment? Can they determine, based on information, whether or not an arc flash hazard assessment has been performed? If not, could they do one? Could they interpret an incident energy analysis properly to garner the information that they need in order to provide for their own safety? Do they know what is called the category method, what I call the table method, that is new to this edition of the arc flash standard, that allows for a worker, in the instance that an arc flash hasn't been done, do they know enough using these tables to move forward safely in determining their own PPE level? And also, do they in fact know how to determine an arc flash boundary? Typically, an arc flash boundary, if done properly, is determined by calculation. But this table method allows for a kind of a default boundary to be established based on certain criteria, and a properly trained worker is going to know how to do that. Once again, another thing that needs to be assessed as far as a worker's knowledge. We mentioned this one earlier. Do they in fact understand what they're looking at when they're looking at one of these arc flash labels? Do they know how to interpret the information? Do they know how to choose the right protective equipment? Do they know how to care for it? Do they know the limitations of it? Do they know how to recognize when the protective garments maybe aren't up to task? I mean, when you're doing a visual inspection of an arc flash rated set of coveralls, for example, what might you see that would make you question the integrity of them? It's not just whether or not they have holes in them. There's a lot of other things you need to look at and assess. And a qualified worker would know what to do, would know what criteria to be interested in. What else here? How to select, care for, use insulating or insulated tools. Someone hands you a tool that supposedly has a certain voltage rating. What might you see that would question its capabilities, question whether or not it's suitable for the task. The right and the wrong way to use what they call alerting techniques, like I mentioned earlier, the warning tape that goes around your work area, the right and wrong way to set up barricades, whether or not you're allowed to use attendants or post guards as opposed to actually using a physical barrier. You know, when is that acceptable? Once again, it's a product of proper safety training. Understanding work practices with regards to the risk of getting near overhead or underground power lines. Moving vehicles through an area where you have overhead power lines, and understanding and being aware of limits of how close you can get to different lines based on the voltage and also based on the vehicle in question. Once again, task-specific training. So task-specific assessment has to be performed. A qualified worker is someone who is so determined to be able to perform these tasks, would know how to do a proper job briefing. He would know enough about the job that he could talk with other people that are going to be involved with the process and walk through what's about to take place. He could describe the procedures. He could point out the hazards associated with it. He understands the documentation associated with it. He understands the equipment enough to know what the maintenance requirements would be on it. All these things are the so-called tangibles that need to be looked at as to what skill set or what knowledge set does this person possess with regards to what it is we're asking him to do. Last but not least here, the simple things. Using cord and plug connected equipment, knowing when ground fault protective equipment is required, knowing how it works, knowing what condition under which you can't necessarily rely on ground fault protection, when it's mandated. Once again, fundamental knowledge, the kinds of things that your typical everyday worker can't necessarily be expected to draw on without having necessarily gone through some task-specific training in the past. That being said, here's a little what we call a decision tree that will probably go a long way in helping the powers that be or whoever is tasked with making this decision determine whether or not a person is in fact qualified. Basic ingredient, we talked about it right out of the gate. Of course, they have to be trained. What does trained mean? Well, not only have they been taught, have they learned? What is our tool? What is our gauge that we've relied on to judge or find out exactly, did anything sink in? Did this person actually acquire knowledge, or did he just sit here in our room for a day or two and go through the motions? Also, remember our magic word, can they demonstrate the ability to perform this task safely? Can they demonstrate that when opening this cabinet, when removing this cover, that they do in fact recognize which part of this equipment is deadly and which part's not? Where can I reach? Where can I not? Very detailed assessment based on this relatively simple word, whether or not they've been trained. Another one, are they able to understand and recognize the hazards, both the basic and also the specific hazards associated with electrical work in general, but also, as we just said, with the task at hand? Well, in many ways, the demand, the responsibility, when it falls on us, is do we know enough about it? Or whoever we have assigned the task of making this assessment, do they know enough about the task at hand to determine whether or not this person in question knows enough about it? It is a difficult assessment to make in many ways, especially depending on some of the equipment, some of the tasks that they may be performing. Are they capable of performing the procedures and policies necessary depending on where they're doing this work, there are going to be certain mandated practices, both through established repair or maintenance procedures, but also through certain safety policies that are in place to make sure that the worker and the people around the worker are protected from what's taking place. Do they know how to protect people from the exposure of these potential hazards, and not just forget that it's not just about their own safety. One of the things that I always point out to my workers is when you remove a cover, when you open up a door and you expose energized components, you own that. You're the qualified person. You're the one that created the risk. You're the one that is exposing this hazard. You own the responsibility of making sure that not only you and the people you're working with are protected from that, but anyone else who can come bebopping into your area, you also have the responsibility of protecting them. And it's a responsibility that shouldn't be taken lightly. And as far as determining their qualifications, it's something you have to weigh. Do they know how to do this properly? This is one I really didn't mention, but it is one of the specific criteria that's mentioned in the 70E document as to whether or not somebody's qualified. Is this person able, capable, knowledgeable in methods of release? We've all heard the horror stories of workers getting hung up on energized pieces of equipment. There's so much current flowing through their body that they can't let go. Obviously, there's a right way and a wrong way to help a person like that. And part of the mandated safety training is someone who is deemed qualified will know and understand both what these methods are and how to utilize them, how to implement them. Last thing I want to point out, or the first thing I want to point out in this one here is actually the last topic. It says when first responder. They just changed this in the safety rules with this edition. In previous editions, it was anyone who did electrical work, anyone who was exposed to these types of hazards was required to know first aid, to be first aid certified, CPR certified, AED certified. Well, they kind of pulled back on the reins with that because there are a lot of places where different places in the facility, different sections, different shifts, they already have people in place for whom the requirement, as they say, are the first responders, the go team, if you will, in the event of an accident. These people are already trained and responsible with getting there first and rendering first assistance. So only when someone has that responsibility now are they required to carry these certifications. Makes it a little easier to implement that one. This was very fundamental. A qualified person will be able to identify and understand the relationship between electrical hazards that are being exposed in the practice of their work and the level and type of possible injury that they could experience. I mean, that's a basic tenet there. They're knowledgeable regarding the construction of equipment. We talked about this one. Remember the auto mechanic that's going to work on your car but has no idea how it works. Not conducive to anybody's safety or satisfied customer for that matter. Knowledgeable regarding the operation of certain systems. A good example here is switching sequences. Shutting down certain systems in the wrong way can cause a lot of problems. Understanding certain systems that can be automatically switched back on again is critical to an electrician's safety as far as knowing whether or not what they're performing and what they're doing can be done safely. Knowledge about the equipment is kind of a given. Maintenance standards, maintenance requirements. Yeah, that, as it says right here, that kind of falls under knowledge of the operation. But moving forward, maintenance is going to be, and specifically condition of maintenance on equipment, is going to be one of the ways that a qualified person is asked to deem whether or not what it is they're about to do is in fact safe. A qualified person has the ability to recognize and avoid hazards. This goes back to, once again, their understanding of the process, their understanding of the equipment, their understanding, recognition of the hazards at hand, They're familiar with certain precautionary techniques. This almost goes back to the has demonstrated clause again. They're familiar with PPE, both shock-related and arc-related PPE. They're familiar with insulating and shielding materials, test equipment, limitations on insulated tools, so on and so forth. Is permitted to work operating at 50 volts or more. That's a primary example. Have they in the past demonstrated the knowledge necessary that would deem them capable of working on this equipment within the limited approach boundary? If they don't know what the limited approach boundary is, that's a big red flag. Knowledgeable with regards to energized conductors, circuit parts on the system in question. At a very minimum, they have the knowledge and techniques, they possess the knowledge and techniques necessary to distinguish exposed parts from other parts. I mean, that's fundamental to determining whether or not they're capable of doing this job safely and properly. If called upon, they could identify the nominal system of the voltage just by knowledge of certain information. It's not talking about, well, do they know how to get a meter and go in here and measure the voltage? Do they know how to determine it without having to do that? You know, do they know how to determine, looking at the equipment, what it is that they're working on? Do they understand the approach boundaries? Do they understand the limits that are put into play when you get inside these different approach boundaries? All a reflection of arc flash safety training. And all of this as well. Do they understand the decision-making process? Can they utilize their knowledge with regards to the hazards that are present, required PPE, if they're in charge? Can they perform the task safely? Can they assess other people's abilities with regards to what they're going to be doing? Do they understand plant procedures, arc flash procedures, OSHA procedures? Moving on down here, do they know what equipment would need to be present in order to proceed with the task, whether it be first aid kits, if deemed necessary, AEDs, emergency supplies? All of this, once again, is just an out-and-out reflection of not only this person's electrical knowledge, but their electrical safety knowledge as well. And as you can see, this is a very, very detailed set of determinations. And it is a very sizable task, a very sizable undertaking. But that being said, don't forget, if you have in any way, shape, or form questions, things that you would like to hear. I do see that my chat window is flashing. I want to open up this chat window here shortly, but I wanted to wrap this up when I realized where I was in the presentation. We are out here. Do not hesitate to reach out to us through email or whatever the case may be, and we would be more than happy to help you in your task as far as setting up these systems. And that being said, thank you for joining us. I'm sorry?
Mike, I've got the questions gathered for you, but one of the ones that we got most frequently was, is this presentation available to you? And absolutely it is. Some of you have already sent your information already. That's great. Everyone will receive a follow-up email over the next 24 hours. If you need a copy of the presentation, you can simply reply to that email. It comes directly to me. I'm happy to send you one. Also, if you want to review this webinar or somebody in your facility missed it, the webinar in its entirety will be available on our YouTube channel. That'll come up hopefully today, certainly by early next week. But with that, Mike, we're going to get into some questions. And the first one we have is, how does the qualified person definition apply to de-energized work?
If it's the part you have to be careful about here is, if it's just de-energized, it's still not considered electrically safe. You need someone who is qualified, who is knowledgeable about the equipment to deem whether or not it's electrically safe. Electrically safe means that all possible sources of energy have been identified and isolated, locked out, to use the required term. It's been properly tested to assure that it is in fact dead. There is a prescribed method, a prescribed procedure that is mandated in order to verify an absence of energy. And then last but not least, in certain circumstances, if there's ever a possibility of having voltage induced into the equipment that's being worked on by neighboring equipment that's still energized, that has to be accounted for as well through grounding and bonding. But until it is deemed electrically safe in the set of steps that OSHA mandates, even though you've de-energized it and just shut the power off, it's still required that only qualified people work on it.
Thanks, Mike. And do you feel that all employees should take safety training, and there was an emphasis on all employees?
I think all employees should take some degree of safety training. Obviously, someone who is going to be actually doing the electrical work is going to need a much higher degree of training. But I think every employee in a facility should have to have at least electrical safety basic training in order to, one, if they do in fact come on a work area where electrical workers are working, they recognize the hazards associated with getting too close. Two, electrical workers and everybody else somewhere along the line are going to be called upon to either interact with or work around electrical equipment in its normal status. I mean, we do it at home when we reset a breaker. I mean, we all do that. Non-electrical workers, having been given basic training, would know how to recognize when this typical equipment is in maybe an out of the ordinary state, and maybe recognize a problem and not to interact with that equipment. I just think that everybody could benefit from it.
The next question we have, Mike, is if electrical contractors come in and work in our facility, do they too need to show documentation that the person doing the electrical work has been through an arc flash training, for example?
Yes. The basic rule is that's called as a host contractor relationship. I always call it, you have the home team and you have the out-of-town team. When the out-of-town team comes in and plays ball in your ballpark, they play by your rules. Now, they're perfectly free to have even more stringent requirements on their workers. But just because they don't work for you per se, when they're a contractor and in your facility, you're still responsible for them in your facility. There's about a dozen articles in Article 110 of the 70E document that specifically spells that out. It would even be, for me, it would be part of in the contract process when we're agreeing to have the work done. I would want some kind of verification that the people coming to work in my plant are in fact qualified. Now, it's not up to me to make that determination. It's up to their employer to do it. And that's spelled out in the 70E as well. But they have the responsibility of providing that proof.
All right. Next question says, since electricians normally work together, at least they do it at this person's facility, should the electricians still be required to learn CPR? The second electrician could be considered a first responder. Just an idea, really, since I'm pushing this at my facility. But Mike, why don't you opine on that one?
My fallback on that one is what I said about a little earlier there, is they've already moderated their requirements on that. Believe me, there is absolutely nothing wrong. I honestly believe anyone that does electrical work in any way, shape, or form should be CPR certified. It's not a difficult thing to acquire. But at the very least, you should most definitely have someone in the area. The mandates no longer require that all of the workers carry the CPR, the certification, I mean. As long as if you do have designated first responders in the plant, they're the ones that are required to have it. If you don't have first responders, then everybody doing it has to. Mike,
this next question asks simply, what can I do to convince management that we need a QEW program?
One of the more powerful, more persuasive arguments I've always found is the fact that, one, there's never a shortage of available statistics. And not just of fatalities. I mean, obviously fatalities carry a lot more weight, but if you look at the statistics on, say, the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, or even on OSHA's website, even with all of the effort that's been put forth over the last 20 years, there's still just an unbelievable number of people getting hurt or killed in this line of work. And when you read the reports and you see why these accidents are happening, it would be so easily avoided if there was just more attention paid to determining, does this worker in fact know what they need to know? I've told I don't know how many classes over the years, looking back, that one of the easiest ways to be deemed qualified was to be the only one available for what needs done. And talk about rolling the dice with someone's health and welfare. I mean, but that it happens so many times. Look, this needs done. You're the only one available. Jump in there and do it. Just be careful. Well, that's not adequate.
All right. Next question, I believe you answered this at the top of the program, Mike, but is qualified defined by a specific regulatory agency that has enforcement power, or is that determination largely left to discretion of the employer and its risk management practices? Can you clarify that a little bit?
If you look in the National Electrical Code, if you look in the OSHA directives, and you look in the 70E document, which everything that we're talking about here today is based on, it is almost a verbatim description. In fact, the only difference in the National Electrical Code, it just says skills and knowledge. When you get into OSHA, this is when they require the demonstrated skills and knowledge. But other than that word, it is verbatim. It is exactly how they define it, as I did here at the beginning of this course. The tricky part about it is applying the main tenets of the definition, the demonstrated skills, the knowledge. The safety training is actually easy. I mean, the safety document itself pretty much mandates what the required safety training has to be, because that's what the person's required safety knowledge has to consist of. But their overall, like their trade knowledge, their work history, and everything else, that is probably the most difficult one to assess from the perspective of a supervisor, because you have to have certain knowledge of this person's work past. What tasks have you seen him, witnessed him perform in the past, and based on that, can you justifiably say that he possesses the skills for what you're asking him to do? So the definition itself is very specific, and it's spelled out in many places in the industry. It's the interpretation of it, or better yet, the application of it to a given employee that gets very challenging.
Right. And it looks like the end of our questions, Mike.
That's it.
That's it.
Wow. Well, I hope everybody got something out of it. I know the hour went by rather quickly for me, but they always do. Use judgment. Use a certain amount of responsibility in rolling these programs out and in determining these people's qualifications. It's very easy as a worker to want to overstate your abilities, to overstate your qualifications. It's one of the reasons why workers aren't allowed to determine on their own what their qualifications are. You have to look at what they say, what they've done, or whatever with a grain of salt, and compare it to what it is they're being asked to do. And it's not an enviable task in any way, shape, or form, but it's one that has to be assigned to someone and these determinations made. I mean, it's in the interest of people's lives and limbs. So that being said, folks, like I say, if you need to get a hold of me, my email address is mlietzel@tpctrainingcode.com. Do not hesitate to contact me. I may not respond right away. If I'm in a class or traveling somewhere in the country, I may not respond right away, but I will get back to you. I understand what some of you are up against. Have a happy holiday weekend, everybody. Be safe.